This is South Tyrol. The houses here are the classic wooden chalets with steep roofs and painted shutters, the kind you see all over the Austrian Alps. The food is Austrian too. Schnitzel, spätzle, and apple strudel. Walk into any restaurant and the menu looks like they're straight out of Vienna. And everyone speaks German. It's the main language here. The architecture, the tradition, the culture, everything about this place screams Austria. Except it's not in Austria. It's in Italy, and has been for over 100 years. This entire German-speaking, Austria-looking region is officially Italian territory. Hi, I'm Sean with Mapped Out, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through the exact history of how this German-speaking region ended up in Italy, and why it took decades of conflict and violence for the two sides to finally figure out how to make it work. This is the story of South Tyrol. From the Middle Ages to 1918, for roughly 1,000 years, Tyrol was a unified county. It stretched from the Brenner Pass in the north all the way to Trento in the south. The Brenner Pass is the lowest point through the Alps, at around 1370 meters. If you wanted to move armies, trade goods, or just travel between northern Europe and Italy, you went through the Brenner Pass. Every other alpine pass is higher, steeper, and probably more dangerous, which meant Tyrol controlled one of the most strategic routes in Europe. In 1363, the Habsburgs acquired Tyrol. But Tyrol didn't just merge into the empire. It wasn't just part of Austria, it had its own identity, its own laws. In 1511, Emperor Maximilian I granted Tyrol a constitution called the Tyrolean Landlibel. Under this arrangement, Tyroleans only had to defend their own border. They didn't have to fight in the Habsburg wars elsewhere, so no distant campaigns or foreign wars. This created a militia system, like the Tyrolean Rifles, who were soldiers who protected Tyrolean land, but nothing beyond it. From 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War was wrecking the rest of Europe. Across Germany and Austria, entire towns were being burned down, and people were running out of food. But inside Tyrol, things were different. Tyrolean men didn't have to go off and fight in someone else's war. Instead, they stayed right at the mountain passes and guarded the entrance to their homes. While the rest of the empire was falling apart, Tyrol just bunkered down and waited for the storm to pass. Living like this for 100 years changed how people saw themselves. That old law wasn't just another piece of paper anymore. It's who they were. They started to feel like they weren't just another part of the big empire. They were Tyroleans, and they were proud of it. But that pride was about to be put to the ultimate test by a man who didn't care about their old laws or their mountain borders. Good old Napoleon. In 1805, Napoleon defeats Austria at the Battle of Austerlitz, one of the most decisive battles in European history. Austria is crushed. And in the Peace of Pressburg that follows, Austria is forced to cede Tyrol to the Kingdom of Bavaria, Napoleon's German ally. Bavaria took control in 1806, and they don't necessarily care about the Landlibel and their previous arrangements. In 1808, Bavaria abolishes the county entirely. So Tyrol is split into 3 districts, Inn, Isaac, and Etsch. So there was no more special constitutional status or Tyrolean autonomy. Worse even yet, the Bavarians actually introduced conscription. Tyrolean men were now forced to serve in the Bavarian army, which meant fighting for Napoleon, in Spain, in Poland, wherever Bavaria sent them. So, understandably, the Tyroleans are furious. They petition Bavaria, they appeal to Vienna. Austria can't or won't help, so they decide to fight. The leader of the rebels is Andreas Hofer. He's not a general or some nobleman, just a local who refuses to accept Bavarian rule. In April of 1809, the Tyrolean rebellion begins. Sharpshooters ambush Bavarian and French troops in mountain passes. They know the terrain, the Bavarians don't, and they win. Over the next several months, Tyroleans fight 4 major battles at Bergisel, a hill outside Innsbruck. They win 3 of them. By August, Bavarian forces had been driven out. For a few months, Tyrol is free. Not Austrians or Bavarians, just Tyroleans. But then Austria loses the wider European war, the War of the Fifth Coalition. In October of 1809, Austria signs the Treaty of Saint-Germain. Austria officially gives up all claims to Tyrol, along with other territories. The Tyroleans felt betrayed because they were still winning their local rebellion when they were sold out by their own emperor. And by November, French and Bavarian forces reconquer Tyrol, with overwhelming numbers. The rebellion is crushed. Hofer flees into the mountains and he hides in a remote alpine hut. But in January of 1810, he's betrayed by a local. He's arrested and brought to Mantua in northern Italy. Napoleon orders his execution. And on February 20th, 1810, Andreas Hofer is shot by a firing squad. His last words were,
Ach, wie schießt ihr schlecht.
He becomes a martyr and a hero, a symbol of Tyrolean resistance. They still sing songs about him today. Unfortunately, things are about to get a lot worse for Tyrol. Just days after Hofer's execution, Napoleon put pressure on Bavaria to cede southern Tyrol to the Kingdom of Italy. This included Trentino, but it also included Bozen and much of the German-speaking South Tyrol. For the first time in centuries, Tyrol is physically divided. Northern Tyrol remains under Bavaria, while southern Tyrol, which included tens of thousands of German speakers, is now part of Napoleon's Italian kingdom. Not because they speak Italian or they identify as Italian. It was because Napoleon wanted control and drew a line on a map. This lasts for 4 years, from 1810 to 1814. When Napoleon finally falls in 1814, the leaders of Europe meet in Vienna. They're redrawing the entire map of Europe and trying to put the puzzle back together. Tyrol gets reunified, and all of it, both north and south, are returned to Austria. From 1815 to 1918, for the next 103 years, Tyrol remains unified under Austrian rule. But Tyroleans remembered the occupation, rebellion, execution, the split. The outsiders divided the country once, and it can happen again. Now, about that language situation. Tyrol was politically unified, but it wasn't linguistically uniform. The northern and central regions, of what's now Austria and South Tyrol, spoke German with various dialects. The southern region around Trento spoke Italian, more specifically Lombard and Venetian dialects, but still Italian. The Germans called this area Welsh Tyrol, literally Romance Tyrol or Italian Tyrol. So Tyrol had 2 linguistic zones, German-speaking Tyrol in the north, or what's now South Tyrol, or Italian-speaking Trentino in the south. So what I find interesting is this line between the 2 languages, it didn't move for hundreds of years. The German speakers stayed in the north and the Italian speakers stayed in the south. They were perfectly fine living together under the same Tyrolean flag, even though they spoke different languages. Which is why what happens after World War I is so jarring. Because when Italy demands Tyrol after the war, they have a legitimate claim to Trentino. The people there spoke Italian. Many identified with Italy. Some even fought for Italy during the war, even at risk of execution for treason. South Tyrol? Well, that was different. No one identified as Italian. It had been German-speaking for as long as anyone could remember. But Italy wanted it anyways, not for the people or the mountains, but for Brenner Pass. Because at the time, whoever controlled Brenner controlled the gateway between Northern Europe and Italy. When the First World War starts in 1914, Italy is technically allied with Austria-Hungary and Germany through the Triple Alliance. But Italy doesn't join the war. They declare neutrality. Both sides want Italy. The Allies want Italy to attack Austria-Hungary from the south, open a second front, and force Austria to split their armies. The Central Powers want Italy to stay neutral, or better yet, honor the Triple Alliance and join them. So the Allies make Italy an offer they can't refuse, in secret. A secret agreement between Italy and the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia. If Italy joins the Allies, and they win the war, Italy will get a whole bunch of promised territories, including South Tyrol. And here's what Article 4 of the treaty said about it specifically. Italy gets the southern part of the County of Tyrol, with the frontier being the natural geographic boundary presented by the watershed of the Alps. Italy's border would run along the highest peak of the Alps. It's a decent geography border, but it ignores the language boundaries and the ethnic populations. But why though? It's really just Brenner's Pass. The pass is wide, relatively flat for an alpine crossing, and you can move large armies across it. This was really just pure politics and military strategy. It had nothing to do with the people living there. And wouldn't you know, Italy took the carrot and signed the treaty. And on May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary. For the next 3 years, the Alps became a nightmare, and it wasn't just typical trench warfare of World War I. The mountains made it more brutal. Some of the scenarios include digging a trench into ice instead of dirt, living in the glaciers themselves, and hauling up giant cannons up the cliffside. Down by the Isonzo River, the fighting was just as brutal. They fought 11 giant battles in the same spot over and over again, and hundreds of thousands of people never made it home. Austria-Hungary eventually lost. It got split into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The victorious Allies met in Paris in 1919 to once again redraw the map of Europe. Austria, now a tiny republic less than 1/8 of its former size, had no leverage, no army or economy. On September 10th in 1919, Austria signed the Treaty of Saint-Germain. The Austrian chancellor signed it, and he really had no choice. And with that, South Tyrol, which was German-speaking, culturally Tyrolean, Austrian for centuries, was transferred to Italy. It ended up being about 250,000 German speakers that just transferred overnight. No vote or referendum, just a line on the map that followed the peaks of the Alps. Protests erupted in Bozen, in Meran, and in other mountain villages across the region. They sent petitions to Rome and Vienna, and even to the League of Nations. Austria's government protested, but it was powerless, a defeated nation with no army. The League of Nations did nothing. Italy was on the winning side. They got what they were promised. It didn't matter, the treaty was signed. On July 16, 1920, the treaty came into force. The border between Austria and Italy was now at the highest peaks of the Alps, and on the southern side, 250,000 people woke up as Italian citizens, whether they wanted to be or not. At first, Italian control was relatively mild. South Tyrol kept some of the local institutions. German was still used in schools and churches and in town halls. Road signs even stayed in German. Life continued more or less as it had before. But the locals resisted. They flew Tyrolean flags, refused to learn Italian. They kept sending petitions. They hoped this was just temporary, but unfortunately, the Italian government saw this as a threat. If South Tyrol won't assimilate, maybe they'll end up seceding. They did have a rebellious reputation. And then, in October 1922, everything changed. Benito Mussolini and his fascists marched on Rome and seized power. Mussolini's government had a clear ideology. Italy must be Italian. One language, one culture, one people, with no exceptions. So all the regional identities and minority languages, yeah, they had to become Italian. The man in charge of South Tyrol's Italianization was this guy, Ettore Tolome, an Italian nationalist and geographer. He had been advocating for South Tyrol's annexation since before World War I. Now, under Mussolini, he finally had the power to reshape it. Tolome published his blueprint. It included 32 measures for the province. And here is how the forced Italianization went. 1923. The name Tyrol was banned from official use. It's now Alto Adige, the Upper Adige River Valley. The word Tyrol disappears from maps and government documents, everything official. Instruction in schools must be conducted in Italian. German can still be used for prayers and hymns for now. 1925. German language teaching in elementary schools ends entirely. Children who only speak German are now taught in Italian by teachers who often don't speak German themselves. Parents respond to this by organizing secret catacomb schools, underground educational movements. They were held in homes, barns, and in basements. They were teaching children how to read and write German in secret. 1928. All education at every level must be conducted exclusively in Italian. Over 360 German language schools closed, with 30,000 students affected. Next was the name of places. They were systematically Italianized. Sometimes there's a historical Italian name, usually from when these towns were briefly in Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy. Often there isn't, so the fascist government invents Italian names. These are just a couple of the examples. The maps were literally being redrawn to replace their names. By 1927, the government decided to pull the plug on German culture entirely. They started by shutting down every German newspaper in the region. If you wanted to read the news, you had to read it in Italian, or not at all. Next, they went after the libraries. They literally cleared the shelves, throwing away any books written in German. Even social clubs and political groups were forced to close. It became illegal to belong to any group that wasn't run by Mussolini's fascist party. The government did something even more personal. They started changing people's names. The strategy that Mussolini knew was, if you take away a person's name, you take away their connection to the past. Schmidt was told to be Fabri. Müller became Molinero. And that's just crazy to think that the governments have done this everywhere. Japan did it in Korea, the US with Native Americans, and also Italy and Tyrol. Take away someone's name and it takes away their past. And Mussolini's government had another strategy, change the demographics. If you can't make South Tyroleans Italian, import them. The Italian government actively recruited Italian families from the south, from Sicily, Calabria, Campania, to move to South Tyrol. They were offered jobs and subsidized housing, even preferred treatment from the government. Bolzano, historically a small alpine town of around 20,000 people, was targeted for transformation. A massive industrial zone was built south of the old city center, with factories and housing blocks, all designed for the influx of Italian workers. Mussolini didn't just want people to speak Italian, he wanted the city itself to look like Rome. He started building massive new neighborhoods in Bolzano that looked nothing like the cozy wooden houses in the mountains. It was definitely a giant branding project. Every time a local German speaker walked into the city, they were surrounded by these massive stone buildings that screamed, "This isn't your Tyrolean village anymore, this is Italy." By the late 1930s, about 25% of South Tyrol's population is Italian. Most of them were recent arrivals, the majority of them concentrated in Bolzano and a few other towns. Outside the city and the mountain villages, it's still mostly entirely German-speaking. But in Bolzano, the capital, the admin center, Italians are becoming the majority. South Tyrol is becoming two worlds. Bolzano, Italian-speaking, fascist monuments with new Italian residents. The mountains, German-speaking, traditional Alpine culture, and resentful locals. For a local German speaker, daily life became a series of traps. Every interaction with the world, from paying bills to standing in a crowd, was now happening in a language designed to make you feel like a stranger in your own neighborhood. And then some people leave. They immigrate to Austria and Germany, or to anywhere else that speaks German. Most just endure, though, quietly resenting and quietly remembering, just waiting. And then Adolf Hitler makes a deal with Benito Mussolini. Germany and Italy are allies now. The Rome-Berlin axis. Hitler wants to keep Mussolini happy, and Italy's support is crucial to his plans in Europe. So Hitler offers South Tyroleans a choice. The two options were, choose to immigrate to Nazi Germany, or its annexed territories, or choose to stay in Italy and permanently accept Italianization, give up German identity, language, and culture. It's presented as a free choice, but in reality, it's coercion. Choose Germany and abandon your home, your land, and your business, but keep the language. Or choose Italy, keep your home, but lose your identity. 85 to 86% of South Tyroleans vote to leave. They rather move to Nazi Germany with its regime and impending war than stay in fascist Italy. It's crazy how desperate they must have been, that Hitler's Germany seemed preferable to Mussolini's Italy. Some actually immigrate, mostly in 1939 and 1940, before the war fully escalates. But then World War II starts in September of 1939. The borders became militarized, transportation breaks down, and resettlement programs stall. By 1943, only about 75,000 people actually had immigrated. The rest stayed, not because they had changed their minds, because they couldn't leave. And then the war consumed everything. Italy switched sides in 1943. Germany occupied northern Italy, including South Tyrol. The region became a war zone. The war ends in 1945. Mussolini and Hitler are both dead. South Tyroleans hope, maybe now, maybe finally, that they could return to Austria. But Austria doesn't exist anymore, not as an independent country. It's occupied by the Allies, divided into 4 zones. And the Allies have other plans for South Tyrol. In 1946, the Allied powers meet in Paris to finalize the post-war borders of Europe, to once again draw another map. Austria formally requests the return of South Tyrol. The Allies refuse. Why? Well, Italy switched sides in 1943 and fought against Germany. They're technically on the winning side. The Soviet Union suspects Austria of Nazi collaboration, since it was annexed by Nazi Germany. Redrawing the borders in 1946 would have set up dangerous precedent. Dozens of other territory disputes could reopen. And Austria has no leverage. They're occupied. They can't make demands. Instead, Austria's foreign minister and Italy's prime minister, who was actually from Trento, negotiate an agreement. The Gruber de Gasperi Agreement was signed September 5, 1946. South Tyrol stays in Italy, but it promises autonomy for the German-speaking population, with language rights, protection of their ethnic character and cultural traditions, and self-governance in local matters. But of course there's a problem. The autonomous region combines South Tyrol and Trentino, the Italian-speaking province of the south. One region but 2 provinces. This dilutes the German-speaking majority. When you combine the 2 provinces, Italian speakers became the majority. In the regional parliament, where the real power lies, Italian speakers can outvote German speakers on every issue. Autonomy exists on paper and in practice, but very little changes. The government said German was allowed, you still had to speak Italian to get everything done. All the names had stayed Italian, and the schools were still mostly taught in Italian. For over a decade, South Tyroleans protested, peacefully. Of course, history repeats itself. They send petitions to Rome and to Vienna, but nothing changes. In 1956, Austria brings the case to the United Nations. It actually does an investigation, and it passes a resolution in 1960. Italy must honor the agreement, give South Tyrol real autonomy. Italy agrees to study the issue, really look into it. Of course, nothing happens, just typical political promises that are made and eventually broken. By 1960, some South Tyroleans decide peaceful protest had failed. maybe they need to look into something a little extra. Enter the BAS. It stands for the Committee for the Liberation of South Tyrol. It wasn't a massive army, it was a secret underground group of about 100 people. It was a mix of old fighters who hated Mussolini and young rebels who were tired of waiting for the government to change. Their goal was simple: get out of Italy. They wanted to be independent or to go back to Austria, and they were done asking nicely. So they start with infrastructure: power lines, railroad tracks, government buildings, monuments to Mussolini. No people or civilians, just targets that would disrupt Italian control and grab headlines. Such a headline happened on the night of June the 11th of 1961, Feuernacht, the Fire Night. In a single coordinated attack, 37 electrical towers are destroyed all across South Tyrol. Nobody dies, the BAS deliberately targeted the infrastructure, but the goal was unmistakable: Italy cannot ignore us anymore. The Italian government didn't just arrest a few people, they swarmed the region with police and soldiers. Hundreds of people were thrown in jail. The questioning was brutal, and some prisoners even claimed they were tortured to get information. But the most frustrating part was the trials. Even though these people were on trial for their lives, the judges forced everything to be in Italian. The German-speaking defendants can't testify in their own language. And sadly, the violence doesn't stop. It escalates. Through the 1960s into the 1970s, attacks continue. The violence was getting out of control. It wasn't just power lines anymore. It was shootouts and deadly mistakes. By the late 1960s, Italy realized they couldn't just police their way out of this. The bombs were scaring away tourists, and the world was watching, and locals weren't backing down. They had to talk. Finally, in 1972, a massive deal was struck called the Second Autonomy Statute, and it didn't just change the laws, it handed the keys to the province back to the people who lived there. So today, South Tyrol, or Alto Adige, is this interesting area in Europe. It's a conflict zone that transformed into one of the wealthiest places in Europe. If you look at the most recent census, you can see that people are split today. 69% speak German as their first language. They are the majority, living in every mountain village and valley. 26% speak Italian. Most of them live in the bigger cities like Bolzano, where Mussolini's New Italy project was the strongest. And then there's a small special group, 4% who speak Ladin. It's this super ancient language that's been tucked away in isolated spots like Val Gardenia for thousands of years. Even though there are these three different groups, the economy is thriving. While the rest of Italy struggles with high unemployment, South Tyrol is much lower. Fun fact, they produce 10% of all the apples in Europe and run world-class ski resorts. But the real magic is the border has basically vanished. Thanks to the EU, you can drive from Bolzano to Innsbruck, Austria without ever having to stop for a passport check. The line on the map that caused 70 years of war is just a speed limit sign now. Is it perfect? No. About 11% of people still vote for total independence. There are still arguments over whether new immigrants should learn German or Italian first. And sometimes you get these funny moments, like the Italian national hockey team being made up of guys with German last names who speak German in the locker rooms. But at least they aren't fighting anymore. It took 100 years and a lot of bloodshed to fix what a few map makers broke in 1919. And Napoleon, you can't forget about what he did. They tried to draw a neat line along the mountain peaks. They forgot that the culture doesn't stop at a summit. Today the map still shows the jagged line, but if you go through the streets of Bozen or Bolzano, you'll see that the V missing from the bottom of Austria is still very much alive. The map makers might have made a mistake in 1919, but today that mistake has become one of the most unique corners in Europe. It's not quite Austria, it's not quite Italy, it's just South Tyrol, and maybe that's exactly how it should be. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. I'm Sean, and this is Mapped Out with Sean. If you think this border is weird, you should see what a 2,000-year-old Roman road did to the map of Belgium. It created this language divide so sharp that it split the country in half today. Check that out right here, and I'll see you on the next map.